Hi, and welcome to the Debate Drills Academy. Today we're going to be analyzing the Terrorism Disadvantage on the public forum topic for 2021, which is about NSA surveillance of Americans and legal permanent residents. So, in the previous course, we discussed the topic analysis, what some of the arguments that the pro and the con can make on this resolution for January 2021. Today, we're going to be focusing on a particular position that the con has access to, which is the terrorism disadvantage. A disadvantage being a reason that the pro side is bad and produces some bad effect that should outweigh the advantages presented by the pro side. So in this lecture, we're going to talk through the overall thesis of this disadvantage, and then look at some specific cards that you'll have access to, attached below in the file that you can download. So let's begin. As discussed in the topic analysis initially, the terrorism disadvantage claims the importance of data that the NSA can collect for being able to track down and surveil terrorists. That the argument paints a fairly alarmist and scary picture of what's happening in the US currently. That terrorists are always looking for new ways to be able to conduct plots against the US, and the role of the NSA is being able to foil those plots and be able to find information to stop them before they can happen. So, a frequently cited statistic that you might hear is that there were between 49 and 54 terrorism plots that have been stopped due to Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. So, to review briefly, we discussed what Section 702 and what FISA are in the topic analysis, but this allows for incidental data collection on Americans. So, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was originally from 1978, established that data could be collected on foreigners, so those that are not within the United States. However, an amendment to that, Section 702, was provided the wellspring of authority for being able to collect data on those that perhaps are in the United States, either foreigners in the United States or, importantly, Americans that are in contact with people in question. And this is known as incidental collection because the purpose wasn't to collect information on the Americans, but maybe they were people of interest or speaking with people of interest more specifically, which leads to their information being included as well. And remember, reading a set of cards that establish that Section 702 is part and parcel with surveillance on Americans will be critical to being able to leverage this disadvantage as well as other potential disadvantages. So let's look through some evidence now to establish what this argument might look like. So if you look at this first card, the Jaffer 17 card, this establishes that Section 702 is important for being able to get information on foreigners and Americans, and importantly, the interplay between those. So when there is a terrorist plot that maybe involves coordination between Americans and people abroad. So 702 has provided invaluable information in the fight against terrorism. 25% of all current intel is collected under 702. That it's about communications with Americans. So when your opponent asks you, why are Americans key for this? Why can't we get the information by surveilling those that are outside of the country? This line about information about terrorists communicating with Americans is the key. There's also a separate link here about radicalizing our own people. That not being able to surveil Americans would mean that we're unable to tell when terrorists are trying to recruit people from within the US themselves. And you've probably read some of the stories about people who have left the United States to go fight for ISIS. That proves that it's not really just a made-up thing, that there is in fact records, there are records of people who have been radicalized as a result of seeing propaganda, and otherwise just finding out more information, and then ending up joining terrorist causes. So this first piece of evidence establishes the importance of data collection through 702 to ensure that we can stop terrorist plots. We then move on to the next piece of evidence, which is the U14 card. So this establishes the importance of flexibility for the government, that FISA currently does not require probable cause, and importantly, that FISA allows the government to obtain information without a warrant, and they just are able to collect as much information as possible. This link is a little bit broader than the first one, but it establishes that the judge should be skeptical of any attempt to impose constraints on the information that is collected by FISA. That when you impose large, broad strokes constraints, such as no collecting data on Americans, it is very likely instead to hamper the ability for intelligence operatives in the NSA to do their jobs. And there are some lines here that sound nice, add some ethos. So the US cannot defend unless it knows where to aim. The primary way is to find Al Qaeda operatives in the US. So again, a reason why looking in the US is essential. So at this point, we've established the efficacy of the current program and the fact that the pro would decimate that by entirely taking off the table information about those that reside in the United States. So then we finally have our piece of impact evidence about the risk of terrorism, in particular nuclear terrorism, which lines up with the U card above, which talks about a nuclear, biological, or chemical attack. The Hayes evidence establishes that terrorists are always looking to acquire nuclear weapons, and if they're able to carry out an attack, it would be absolutely devastating because it would prompt nuclear retaliation. So early warning systems could automatically launch as soon as they see a nuclear strike. So if a terrorist were to launch a nuclear weapon at a state with an early warning system that has what's called launch on warning or automatic launches, they may just launch without any human input. Or we may see a nuclear weapon incoming and assume it's from, say, Russia and face pressure to retaliate, whereas in fact it was from a terrorist group, which can cause miscalculation. So this line, nuclear terrorism could precipitate a massive exchange, establishes the primary answer to the argument that nuclear terrorism would stay constrained, that it would only just lead to a small conflagration as opposed to something that would draw in other powers. So we have now our arguments for the constructive. So the three pieces of evidence you'll likely read in the pro speech, establishing the dangers of the pro in terms of harming the efforts against terrorism. But what's important then is for your later speeches to have additional pieces of evidence that can deal with objections that are raised by the pro. So let's take a look at some of those. An objective that might be raised is that counterterrorism is currently ineffective. Likely the pro has come ready with several cards that say, we're looking for a needle in a haystack, counterterrorism is not effective, or even that terrorism is currently high. This Byman piece of evidence does a good job answering those because it ties the low rates of counterterrorism the low rates of terrorism in the world currently to U.S. counterterrorism efforts. So it talks about how disengagement, when the U.S. is not active in counterterrorism campaigns, that allows terrorism to metastasize, giving examples from ISIS, where once we pulled out of the Middle East, ISIS was able to really grow and flourish, but that we've really been able to push back terrorists, which is why only 9 people died in U.S. soil from terrorist attacks. So this piece of evidence is multifaceted. It answers the argument that terrorism is currently spiraling out of control by establishing that no, it's actually fairly constrained. It also answers the argument that counterterrorism is not working because it says that the causal connection between low terrorism and U.S. counterterrorism demonstrates the efficacy of counterterrorism programs. Another objection that might be made is that surveillance limits exist now. In other words, that the NSA is currently restricted from doing everything that it needs to do. This is what's known as a link uniqueness answer, which establishes that the link to the disadvantage, the problem with the pro, is already happening. The link is non-unique. The link has already been triggered. So that's a powerful argument for the pro because it establishes that whatever the con is saying will happen if you vote for the pro has already happened because the link has already been triggered. But this card establishes that Section 702 is actually still strong and that 702 is key. On face, that seems obvious having read the cards from the constructive, which establish the importance of 702. But this card establishes in more depth that 702 has been reauthorized. It's been authorized for the past 6 years, this evidence says, and it's what is key for being able to conduct surveillance on foreigners and also, importantly, incidental collection on Americans. So here, we're going to examine 3 separate link arguments. This is important because these establish different layers to the disadvantage. So as of the constructive, we have a link argument about the importance of collecting data on terrorists who are trying to talk to Americans and using that to foil plots domestically. However, a very strategic way to go for a disadvantage is to have multiple link arguments. That way, if the pro answers one of your link arguments, you have other ones that are separate from that and are insulated, which can give you other ways to get offense, and it puts pressure on the pro's rebuttals to have to answer multiple, often divergent link arguments. So there are 3 additional link arguments to the more generic broad strokes, we need to collect data on Americans who are talking to foreigners who may be carrying out terrorist plots together. The first link is disruption, that it prevents lone wolf mobilization. This is important because it talks about the necessity of conducting surveillance of Americans, even if they are not talking to others abroad. So this is about lone wolves who are trying to maybe just carry out their own unilateral terrorist attacks. So these people are often loosely linked, which means that it's difficult to find probable cause to be able to obtain a warrant, but you still might have valuable information to get from these people. So trying to obtain information without being able to conduct broad surveillance on Americans would be ultimately futile, because those people we would have to obtain a warrant, which would not be actionable. So this requires being able to have surveillance on lone wolves that are within the country to prevent a terrorist attack. A second link argument is deterrence. This one is really powerful because it doesn't rely on actually demonstrating that NSA surveillance is effective. All it requires is demonstrating that the terrorists believe it is effective. So if you're able to convince terrorists their plots will be foiled, they may not even bother trying in the first place, which is the Pavel evidence. So states can deter terrorists by convincing ops are likely to fail. Domestic intel are strong deterrents to attacks. So this is powerful because you do not need to win the efficacy of NSA surveillance, just that they won't bother trying if they think that it's effective. And this piece of evidence does establish that they actually do believe that it is effective. It says there are many cases in which terrorists were deterred, and it even connects it to nuclear terrorism, which is our impact evidence that we presented in the constructive. The third and final link is what's known as a spillover link. This says that the pro ends up biting off far more than they expected. That even if the pro is a small tweak, it ends up snowballing, resulting in larger tweaks that end up resulting in surveillance slowly being eroded. So these arguments often talk about court precedent, that when the court is able to limit something in one case, it likely spirals and then gets cited in future cases for further limits. This piece of evidence is not directly about court precedent, but it does establish the fact that small changes to surveillance can have later knock-on effects that end up restricting surveillance more than was ever intended. So that's what this Olson evidence talks about, that this would likely result in further changes, that if what happens is they end up accepting a restraint on what types of information they can collect, soon that will lead to other types of changes, such as information that can be queried within a database. Okay, so now we've talked through 3 separate link arguments that can make it into your rebuttals. Now we're going to talk about some more answers to common pro-objections. And from a standpoint of file organization, notice how this is geared primarily around things your opponent can say. So AT as an answer to, 702 in American data not key. This is a good way to organize a file because when you're giving a speech, you are primarily answering arguments your opponent makes and resolving their arguments to demonstrate why you are more correct. It's not useful to have a file that is constructed primarily around you extending arguments, because then it's 2 ships passing in the night. So instead, note how this file is organized primarily around answering the arguments that your opponent will make. That's how you should organize block files. So the first argument that we'll talk about is that 702 and American data are not key. The argument that we're able to solve this disadvantage just by still collecting data on foreigners. So we've already read a rack of cards in this constructive that establishes that 702 is key, but there are a couple extra cards here that can also be useful. So this English card cites empirical evidence that talks about a number of times that 702 was used to stop terrorism. And you can use these examples in your speeches to really demonstrate a level of specificity. So it talks about the case of Khalid Ouzani, who was trying to bomb the New York Stock Exchange. It talks about Najibullah Azazi, who was a man in Denver. And it also talks about David Coleman Headley, who was planning to attack a newspaper company. And there are a bunch of other examples that are within this card that you can just reference when asked about this if your opponent raises an argument that says that there are no examples, or if your opponent just directly asks you about this in Crossfire, you would be able to then demonstrate that there are a number of examples where it has been effective in uncovering plots. We then have this next piece of evidence, the Olson evidence, that talks about the importance of flexibility, which again is slightly separate from this first argument, which is about empirical cases where 702 has been useful. This instead establishes the importance of being able to conduct surveillance without constraints that are imposed on what you're able to look for. That given the flexibility and transnational nature of terrorism, being able to conduct searches broadly is necessary. And then this Shea card establishes a similar argument, that The flexibility is necessary because operatives can exist inside of the American homeland. If we're unable to conduct surveillance on people that may be American citizens, that ends up shielding operatives who have information that is of use to us, but then we're barred from being able to access it. And this is useful in terms of author qualifications. It's the director of the Signals Intelligence Directorate at the NSA. So they're talking about their own knowledge based on leading this organization and the information that they have seen, which is another useful wrinkle that you can emphasize in some of this, which is that if you have industry experts who are citing classified information that is not available as open source intel, that it may be difficult for a lot of the critics of surveillance to really grapple with the efficacy of deterrence. They may just not have access to all of the information that establishes how effective this program is. This next header is very similar, answering the argument that you can't cite examples of plots. So the evidence above does give examples of plots, but there's also a card that establishes a useful contingency here that even if you don't solve particular plots, you can still get insight into the organizations, figuring out their cell structures, figuring out who runs the organization, what the activities are. So this evidence does again give examples of plots that were foiled, but it does just talk about being able to understand the overall structure of the organizations. But then there are several pieces of evidence here that establish that, in fact, it actually is effective in stopping attacks. The final argument is answering the information overload objection, which we discussed a little bit in the topic analysis. This is the idea that more information is actually a bad thing, not a good thing. The NSA has too much ancillary information currently that is not actionable, that it can't act on. In particular, most information about Americans is useless, and the most vital information is probably targeted surveillance of those that are known to be operating outside of the United States, as opposed to information on Americans that is collected in bulk or completely indiscriminately. So there are a couple of answers to this. The first is the Weaver evidence, which establishes that the needle in the haystack analogy misunderstands the way that the NSA collects data. It is able to synthesize it and put together strands of evidence in ways to form conclusions that otherwise could not be found. So it's again, not needles in a haystack, but a capability to pull threads. So you get one nugget of information from one source of data, you get a little bit more from another, and you put the pieces together. It's much more of a jigsaw puzzle than just trying to do a search where you just add more hay when you're looking for the needle. It's rather about being able to form some type of cogent hypothesis about this person's involvement. We would not have known that without the information that person X was able to provide. The next piece of evidence is similar, that you need to be able to get more data, not less, because most data is just incomplete. And additionally, because of the fact that most data is ultimately not helpful, most leads are wrong, you need to minimize the risk of throwing out something that is completely useful, which happens if you just get rid of the ability to conduct surveillance. And the final piece of evidence is the Young evidence, which basically establishes in much more of a scientific sense why this overload argument is wrong. That they're able to quickly sift through the data. They have world-beating computer processing capabilities, which means they're able to really sort through it effectively, and that objections to the contrary are wrong. So this is the terrorism disadvantage, which is a core position that the con should be comfortable going for. I hope this was helpful in illustrating what some of the evidence looks like and what some of the arguments are. You can download this file below.